Hello. Hello, everyone. Hello, if you'd like to come and take a seat, we've got a great talk coming up. So our next speaker is Jess Dodson. Jess is at Microsoft. She is a fantastic speaker. I've heard her before at CrikeyCon a few times. Last year, she was here at AusCERT as well. Jess is an engineer at Microsoft. She's puts great information out on the socials. I've seen some fantastic shares on LinkedIn that I keep saving, and one day I'll go back and look at them. But yeah, anyhow, if everyone can welcome Jess.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am giving a talk on zero trust. What does it actually mean? I'm pretty sure we've all heard zero trust banded about a couple of times today alone. I think I've seen at least 3 or 4 talks with zero trust in the title. So for those who don't know me, I am Jess Dodson. I am a customer engineer with Microsoft, focusing on security and identity. Now, please bear with me. I am likely going to need to take drinks of water and sips throughout the session. I wrote my talk and then stupidly went and got COVID, which was a really good idea. So I haven't rehearsed it as much as I'd like, so I am going to be referring to my notes, so please be kind and gentle. I am a purple-haired recovering system administrator, now a security engineer, so I help people and customers try and improve their security, usually by yelling quite loudly. So some of you may have been in some of my sessions previously. I did one last year on security basics. I love yelling about the basics. And this one is all about zero trust, because it's one of the things that I seem to be talking a lot about. It is the buzzword of the moment. Everyone's bandying it about. But if you mention it to management or to operations staff, they're kind of like, zero, what? No joke, most of the organizations that I go into, they know the words zero and trust, but they don't actually know what it means. So we need to do a much better job of explaining what zero trust is, how it applies to our environments, our organizations, and how we access and use the technology we have. And so I wrote this talk. It is quite dry content, so yes, I have put lots of memes through it because you've got to kind of spice the content up. So, zero trust. What does it boil down to? This? Really? I mean, it's in the title, right? Zero trust, trust no one. It makes sense? Not quite. And I think that's what makes zero trust and the whole idea of zero trust with the title of zero trust a bit tricky to explain. And I'm not just talking about explaining it to end users, although explaining it to them can be hard, but I'm talking about explaining it to our management and even to our own operational staff about how we go about implementing zero trust across our technologies, solutions, the policies we're looking at putting in place, the governance we're looking at putting in place. And a lot of the time, I think it's just as confusing to us as well. So when I'm talking to my customers, who are, for the most part, security operations folks, security architects, identity administrators, the occasional sysadmin who's dabbling across into security, no one has a really good idea of what it is from a big picture. And I think that's part of the problem. So how can we expect our users, or more importantly, our management, who are going to be coughing up the dollars to be able to put this stuff in place, to understand what it means to be based on a zero trust architecture if we can't explain it ourselves? So maybe limited trust would be a better way of saying it, but I don't think that sounds quite as snazzy as zero trust. So if zero trust doesn't boil down to trust no one, what does it actually mean? Now, I went through a large number of documents, so many reference architectures, so many different versions, so many different websites. I read through at least a dozen different methodologies of what zero trust is in order to be able to make this talk. Now, I am a little bit biased. Yes, I do work for Microsoft, so I like utilizing some of their ideas, mainly because I talk about it enough that I could probably do it in my sleep. But I am also a recovering identity administrator, so their focus on identity being a really big part of Zero Trust is something that I kind of like. So because of that, I like the trilogy of what Zero Trust is, with the focus being on identity. And I know a lot of you are going to cringe when I say it, but the whole identity is the new security perimeter, it's kind of true. So that's not to say that I don't love me some network segmentation, and we will get to that, but for our current new BYOD, SaaS, PaaS world, identity is queen. So instead of Zero Trust being trust no one, it turns into trust but verify, which I really like. It fits better, it's almost like limited trust, but it's more explicit in what we're trying to do. It does sound better in the original Russian, it rhymes, but we'll have to make do with English, and I am not going to try and pronounce it in the original Russian because I will 100% butcher the shit out of the pronunciation. I'm just not going to do it. So if we're doing trust but verify, how do we go about doing that with the Zero Trust trilogy, as I call it? So first up, verify explicitly. Nice and short, but what does it mean? Every person, every user, every authentication request, every device, every application, every request for data, everything needs to prove they are who they say they are. We need to verify all of the things. We don't just trust that they say they are who they say they are. As part of the trust but verify part, we're focusing on that verification and verifying explicitly. There is no implicit trust here. And when we talk identities, we're not just talking about user identities. We're talking device identities, we're talking application identities, even location identities. It all plays into it. We need to verify it all. Now, I'm sure you all know this one. Likely that if you've ever heard me talk before, you may have heard me talk about least privilege once, twice, couple of thousand times. Role-based access control is something very close to my heart. Least privilege is a fundamental part of that. So it's all about your role-based access controls, least privilege. Give users the rights they need to do their job. No more, no less. I've been preaching about this for over half of my IT career. I'm pretty sure I'm going to be shouting about it until the end of time. We still can't get this right well. So until we actually get it right, I'm going to continue shouting. But it is more than just role-based access control. Least privilege is looking at the privileges for everything you do. So it can look at your least privilege around your network and your least privilege around your data, least privilege around what applications you're accessing. So we're not just talking about least privilege in terms of the way that I talk about it. Not everybody needs global admin rights. We're talking about least privilege across your whole digital estate. And yes, I've said this one before a couple of times as well. So assuming breach, it's almost like some of this was basic. At any given time, we have to assume that at some time, somewhere in our organization, someone is doing something they're not supposed to be doing. Now, that's not to say necessarily that we have a threat actor in our environment, though we very well could. What we're talking about here is that we need to structure our environment in such a way that there is someone in there. We believe there is someone doing something dodgy, and so we structure our environments in a way that they can do the least amount of damage possible, limit that blast radius. Be it a threat actor doing something malicious, or be it an internal insider threat doing something malicious, or just something stupid, which is probably more likely. And this is where we can look at pulling out our network segmentation and dusting it off and bringing it back into the fold, because network segmentation plays into this one as well. So that's great. And we've got these three ideas. We've got verify explicitly, use least privilege, assume breach. That's awesome, but what does that actually mean when we want to go about applying that to our digital estate, to our infrastructure, our environments, our organizations? Buzzword bingo is fantastic. I always love playing a bit of buzzword bingo myself. But having an idea of what you need to do to put that in place is the most important part. We can talk about the abstracts until we're blue in the face, but unless there is some concrete things we can do, it's kind of all for naught. So I've read through a whole bunch of documentation. There's a whole bunch of fancy stuff. There's pages and pages of it online. It is all very tedious, and I fall asleep after about the 4th page. So I've decided to try and sum up as much of it as I can in this presentation and have a little bit of fun with it, because let's be honest, zero trust can be mind-numbingly boring. So we come to the pillars of your digital estate. There is more than 4, but I really like this picture because, yes, one of them is likely to squish you and be like the pain point on your back. So we're going to be talking about the 6 pillars of technology that exist inside of our organizations and what we need to do to focus on implementing zero trust on those particular pillars. Identities. Of course, I'm going to start with identities because it's my favorite. First things first, we need to use strong authentication. Pretty sure everyone here is tired of me talking about MFA. Please just go and turn it on. Strong authentication isn't just an airy-fairy term. MFA is so important, and it shouldn't just be for your top-end users. We're talking everyone. 99% of identity-related breaches can have their effectiveness reduced by having MFA. Brute forces can't work if you have MFA. Even phishing attacks can't work well if you have MFA. So turning MFA on for everyone in your environment is one of the best things you can do to put zero trust in place. Single sign-on. Make it happen. Our users, let's be honest, are going to try and find the path of least resistance. They will reuse passwords, okay? So if we're utilizing something like single sign-on, they're going to be using the same username and password no matter where they are, be it in the cloud or accessing from a device at home or whether they're in your office. So it's going to make it more secure. You're going to have far more control over that identity if you are utilizing single sign-on. Look at using some form of privileged identity or access management. We don't want rights to be assigned at all times. We don't want users and administrators to permanently have those rights. We want them to be able to elevate, possibly get some form of approval involved, have those rights, and then have them removed. No one should have permanent rights. Creating access policies, and you'll hear me talk a lot in this talk about access policies and procedures. Access policies are what's going to underpin your entire zero trust when it comes to identity. So we want to make sure that you have policies created for what your users should be doing when they log on, making sure that they've got MFA turned on, working out where they're coming from, what endpoints they're connecting in from, making sure we're logging all of this data as well, looking for those things like failed login attempts or monitoring what times your users are logging in. So a lot of the time when we look at a standard user, they're logging in sort of between 7 and 9 a.m. and logging off sometime between 4 and 6 p.m. If you see one of your high-level users that's got access to highly critical information logging on at like 2 o'clock in the morning, that should trigger something for you. Or, even better, using your access policies, should block them from being able to access. Putting some form of password protection in place, because we don't want to see reused passwords. We don't want to see insecure passwords. We don't want to see passwords being used that we know have been used in breaches. So using some form of password protection over your users, preventing them from doing some of those very simple but dumb things, lessens the load on you, and it lessens the chance that their account is going to become compromised. The other side of that as well is look at going passwordless, using tokens, using biometrics. I have no idea what my password is. I log on with my face. So it's another way of stepping that up. Users then won't have to remember anything. Users are constantly forgetting things, and users are likely going to be your first point of entry when it comes to any breach. So doing things that make it easier for them and more secure is what you are aiming for. And And then finally, we need to have some form of governance and analytics. And again, you're going to hear me talking a lot about governance today. So making sure you're performing access audits, checking who's logging on, who has access, who has the rights, making sure you're disabling users, removing deprecated users, performing all of those identity life cycle items that you need to do to ensure that the users that are authenticating are who you want to be authenticating. Endpoints. So we need to make sure that we are securing all of our endpoints, and yes, that does include the ones that aren't even ours. I swear that BYOD is going to be the death of us all. But we need to make sure that the devices that are accessing our infrastructure, so the ones that are logging on with our credentials, that are using our applications, they're accessing our organizational data, are storing our organizational data, are registered and enrolled in some way so that we can keep track of them. And then from there, we want to be setting up configuration profiles. We want to make sure that if you are connecting into our environment, you have a VPN, you have got endpoint protection, you have recently updated. I know what location you're coming from, and it's not Latvia at 3 a.m. in the morning. So making sure that you are tracking your endpoints so that you can keep tabs on which ones are coming in, as well as making sure that when they're coming in, they are compliant to whatever policies you've set. Now, this is crucial because without it, we've got some really big risks, because we need to make sure that whatever devices are accessing our network are meeting some form of minimum requirements. They are the requirements that we have set as part of our governance and strategy to say, these are the type of devices we want accessing our information. Applications. I've said it in my security basics talk, but you don't know what you don't know, and applications are probably one of the biggest parts out there when it comes to not knowing things. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that we've got some form of cloud access security broker to inventory all of the applications that our users are using. Okay? And as part of that, we're going to then find all of that lurking shadow IT that's out there, because I guarantee you that it's out there. You will have users using applications that you had no idea about, and you want to find those. So from that point, once we've inventoried, we've worked out what our users are signing into and what they're accessing, we want to know what those applications are doing. So what data are they accessing? What information regarding your users can they see? How are they using that data? So when we're looking at inventorying all of our applications, we are obviously going to be monitoring them. So with that monitoring, in real time, we want to make sure that we've got adaptive access control so we can monitor as the users are authenticated, what they're doing in those applications and whether any of our controls have changed. So they may be accessing an application from within your environment on a laptop, but they may then pick up that laptop and then take it and then go and sit in a coffee shop on an unsecured wireless network and still be accessing that data. We need to adaptively look for that and make sure that we are blocking those kind of access requests when they happen. Now, when we're looking at protecting the data that those applications are accessing, we need to make sure that the data that is ours, that is our organization's data, is staying within our organization, because we are looking very much, when it comes to this kind of stuff, for insider threats. Data exfiltration is one of the main ways to breach an organization. And then finally, one of the things that I really like talking about is making it easier for users, because that, at the end of the day, we are here to serve our users. So make it easy for your users to access applications. Give them some form of catalog that they can download and install applications from. If you don't make it easy for them, they will find a way to circumvent the controls that you've put in place, and that is how you get shadow IT. Data. So similar to our applications, we need to know what we have, because how can we protect it if we don't know about it? Now, as part of finding that data, which I know that that's kind of glossing over it. Finding data in itself is probably one of the hardest parts of our job. But when we find that data, classifying it, because we need to make sure we know what that data is, what level of classification it's at, because we need to be able to protect it. And if we haven't classified it, we don't know what level of protection we need to have for that particular piece of data. Now, these will likely be different depending on your organisation, depending on what level of protection you have within your organisation, be you government or defence or banking, financial, etc. But we need to put some automation around that. And I think automation around data classification is something that we don't do very well. So working out how you can find that data and then automatically classify it based on the type of data it is going to be really important. And then, of course, encrypt it. We need to make sure that our sensitive data, or if possible, all of our data, is encrypted, both in transit and at rest. Again, this is another basic that I don't see done that well or that often. And just like we did with applications, real-time monitoring of how that data is being accessed and used, who's accessing it, what is accessing it, what applications are using it. Because as I said, insider threats are still a thing, data exfiltration is still happening. The data is where the value is at. It's not your infrastructure, it's not your network, it's the data people are after, and that's what you need to protect. With our infrastructure, just-in-time access. Again, I don't see it done all that often. No one should have permanent rights to be able to jump onto a server or a container. It should be as needed. That's the whole idea of just-in-time. Now, I know it is easier said than done, but starting with our crown jewels and working our way down through our technology stack will be a good start of being able to implement this. Find what is your most important stuff and look at putting just-in-time on them, and then work your way down. Yes, it's going to take a long time, but it is totally going to be worth it. Another thing that's really important here is application control on your infrastructure. Because at the end of the day, your servers are just endpoints and applications. That's all they really are. So we need to make sure we know what applications are running on our infrastructure, and that any unauthorized or unvetted applications are blocked and alerted for. We want to know when stuff is running on these highly important pieces of infrastructure that shouldn't be running. And then monitoring is the final step. So assume breach means we need to be keeping a really close eye on all of our infrastructure, be it on-prem or in the cloud. And as part of this monitoring, we need to be doing both proactive and reactive. So proactive is looking for those security improvements, finding ways you can improve on the security of your infrastructure, versus the reactive of constantly fighting fires and finding those alerts that are triggering from things that are going bad. Now, I realize that for a lot of you, reactive is just the standard mode of operation. You are constantly fighting fires. It is constantly a battle of chasing your tail and chasing incidents. We need to slowly move from that. So moving towards the more proactive, putting in those proactive things in place is going to reduce your reactive load. And then network. So what we're talking about here is microsegmentation. I told you we'd get to network segmentation eventually. We're trying to limit lateral movement within your organization. That's the whole idea here. So looking at that assumed breach, putting in place context-driven access controls and just-in-time access across your network, looking at traffic filtering. So making sure that your networks are configured to only allow the traffic they absolutely need. So it's very much that least privilege model of ensuring that the traffic that is traversing your network is only what you require, that you don't have open firewalls, you don't have fully slather open ports, you don't have, like a Darknet Diaries one that I just listened to recently, a domain controller open to the internet for all and sundry to access. So you need to be making sure that you are controlling what is traversing your network. And just like with your infrastructure, we need to be monitoring. So we need to be proactively and reactively responding to threats and potential vulnerabilities as quickly as we possibly can. And that includes utilizing some form of threat protection. So looking at the IOCs that are coming into your environment, utilizing those to automatically block those threats against your environment. Now, I know I said 6 pillars, but we do have a 7th. So this is the foundation pillar. So this is your visibility, automation, and governance. So it underpins all of the other pillars, and I see it, as you can see in this image, it's very precarious because we don't do a very good job of it. So visibility is where monitoring comes into play. Now, I've spoken a lot about monitoring under each of the other pillars, but the issue that I see with visibility is that visibility in itself isn't enough. Having that data isn't enough. You need to be doing something with it. I'll say it again. Collection isn't detection. It's great if you're getting those logs, but unless you're putting them somewhere and doing something with them, it is a waste of time. So making sure that it is feeding into something, that we are giving it context, be it a person who's looking at it, or be it a automation tool, if possible, that we can use to find the signal within the noise. We need to be correlating the data so that we can see the forest for the trees. We need distinct monitoring pieces, absolutely, for all the different parts of our environment and our infrastructure and across our digital estate, but it's of no use if those distinct individual monitoring pieces aren't talking to one another and aren't feeding into something that we can then use to look across the entire digital estate. And then, of course, we've got governance. So much of what we do now is defined by policy. So we need to have policies in place. So this is the fundamental policies and government structures that we put in place to define what is and isn't acceptable for our organisation, because there is no one size fits all. What is and isn't compliant? Remembering that compliance doesn't equal security. You can be compliant with a standard and be completely insecure. So we need to make sure that the governance structures that we put in place work for us in both making us compliant and secure. Maintaining these policies and these governance structures is really important. They are not set and forget. We can't just build them and then walk away, okay? All of them go into forming our zero trust strategy, methodology, and architecture. Righto, so we've got all of our pillars. We've got our identities, our endpoints, applications, our data, our infrastructure, and our network. And of course, our foundation of visibility, governance, and automation. That's quite a lot of stuff. So how does it all fit together to form that zero trust? Now, I'm very, very sorry. I usually don't do this in my slide decks, but I do have a non-meme slide. I promised you that it's for a good reason, and it's the only slide in my deck that isn't a meme, but you know I wouldn't do it if it wasn't important. So, yes, I have blatantly pinched this from some documentation, and it is Microsoft documentation, but I have chosen this one specifically because it is completely vendor agnostic. There is nothing in here that lists any specific type of application, any type of vendor product, any type of operating system. It is completely vendor neutral, which is why I absolutely love it. This can apply to any environment. So coming from our identities with our strong authentication and our monitoring of identity risk, our endpoints, be they ours, be they BYOD, be they in an office, be they in a remote location, be they in the cloud, and then going through and classifying our data, ensuring we've got visibility and adaptive access to our applications, control over our infrastructure, and then filtering and segmentation on our network, underpinned by our threat protection, automation, and then our overarching organizational governance and policy, okay? It's a pretty picture. There's a reason that I have it up. This is what we're aiming for. Okay, so this is a zero trust frame. This is a zero trust architecture and methodology. When you are looking at putting zero trust in your environment, you need to look at all of it. And I can hear you going, yes, that's lovely, that's beautiful. Where the shit do I start? So, I like making lists. So these are my big ticket items of what you need to look at doing in order to be able to start putting zero trust in place. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't want you to skip over any of what I've talked about, but these are the couple of things that I think we need to do, and these are the ones that I see organizations getting wrong and what we really need to focus on, okay? So number one, reducing our legacy on-prem infrastructure, okay? Now, I am not the cloud is here to save us all kind of person. I am very well aware that hybrid is here to stay, that everyone is going to have some form of on-prem infrastructure for a while to come yet. At the same time, though, pretty much all of the legacy stuff that we have, so I'm looking at those of you out there who still are running Server 2003 and Server 2008, and I will hunt down every one of them eventually, that all sits on-prem. I don't see a lot of it up in the cloud. If you migrate and lift and shift that up into the cloud, I will slap you. But it's on-prem, so trying to reduce all of that down as much as physically possible. I know it's a hard ask, but it's trying to get rid of that, trying to move that to somewhere that you can control it better and look after the security of it better. Upgrade it to a new operating system, shift it to be a SaaS application, whatever it is you need to do. Managing your identities and endpoints in the cloud, mainly because the two are intrinsically linked, and this then gives you better functionality to utilize up in the cloud. So things like JIT and PAM and identity governance controls, password protection, risk-based access controls, things that we don't really have access to on-prem, and if we can put them up in the cloud, it means that we have more control, because then we're utilizing single sign-on, I hope, and we're controlling our identities no matter where they are, be it on-prem or in the cloud. Tied to the previous point, making sure that devices, no matter whose they are compliant. This is a really big one, making sure you have really good compliancy policies to make sure that you've got what is required to access your network. MFA, I'm not going to yell about it anymore. I've done enough of MFA, but yes, making sure that we've got MFA sorted. Putting access policies and controls in place and enforcing them. It's not enough to have them in place and auditing, we need to enforce. Securing your applications via identity and endpoint integration. So we want to make it easier for our users to be able to access our applications. We don't want to make it harder. And then lastly, monitoring. Please, if it's the only thing you take away, is put in place better monitoring. Feed all of the signals you're getting somewhere central. Put them somewhere where you can look at all of them. Make sure you're correlating across your entire environment. Now, it's not to say that all of that is easy. It's not. It's hard. And with the customers that I've helped, I know that it's hard. But I want to help it make it a little bit easier for you. So my top tips when it comes to this are, you need to balance usability with security, okay? There is no point in us putting security in place when it's going to make the jobs of the people that we are working for harder. We are there to enable them. So we have to do what we can to improve user experience. That really needs to be a focus of what we do. And I don't think it has been a focus of what we've done previously. We've very much been the gatekeepers, the police. We need to switch that around and help our users instead of hinder them. You can't just focus on one piece of the puzzle. So you've heard me talk about monitoring across your entire digital estate. It's because all of it matters. Yes, something is better than nothing, but we have to look at everything. Identity and security are intrinsically tied together. And I've spoken about that from a technology standpoint, but I don't think we do a good enough job of integrating our teams. Quite often when I go into organizations, it is security versus operations. I see so many teams fighting with each other for dominance, siloing each other off and competing against one another. We are not competitors. We should be working together, both security and operations, particularly your identity operations staff, to be able to put a lot of this in place. Automate as much as possible. Let your people do the stuff that is actually important rather than the boring and mundane. And then finally, it isn't all about the tech. You'll notice that I didn't mention products, vendors, technologies. I'm literally interested in how we go about doing this no matter what you are using. There are numerous options out there. Use what works for you. Use what works for your organization, for your business, for your budget. There's no point in us dictating what product you should be using. The policies and controls and governance are more important than the technology you use. So, zero trust. Not really. We trust, but we verify. Everyone and everything needs to prove they are who they say they are in order to get access to anything in our environments. So in the end, zero trust isn't about the tech. It's about the policies and the people who are putting it in place. We need to make sure that we are doing what we can as SecOps people to allow our users, people, to access their data, their applications as securely as possible. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jess. That was great. Have actually got 2 questions here.
Okay.
One you might have just answered is from Colby. Do you have any advice for a company that wants to go passwordless?
It depends on how you want to go about doing it. So going passwordless isn't something you can do just overnight. Users do get a little bit concerned. Making sure, I think, that you have the right devices in place. I think the biggest drawback I've seen for a lot of organisations is they want to go passwordless, they start rolling it out and realise that they haven't found those edge cases, those users that don't want to have an MFA token on their personal mobile phone or a device that isn't compatible with the biometrics you want. So making sure you've got all of that in place first before you start looking at rolling it out to catch those edge cases. Otherwise, you're never going to be able to get a fully passwordless environment in place.
Great. We have another question too. The question is there any advice on managing service partners that require access to legacy apps that can't be upgraded easily?
Try and silo them off as much as possible. So that's where that micro-segmentation comes into play. So you want a very tiny network space that's set aside for those legacy applications or legacy servers that you've got, and you want to make sure that it is strictly controlled and strictly monitored. So those particular things, I see it a lot. I see it a lot in government. I see it a lot in higher ed as well, because there is legacy stuff that we can't get rid of. I know it's going to be there. But trying to section it off and segment it off as much as you physically can and try and remove the reliability on it. So I think that's the issue. A lot of people become reliable on those pieces of technology that they don't look at other options. So removing that reliance and trying to shift people onto something else is going to be a better option.
Great. I think we've got time for one more question. It's from Joshua. Do you have any advice for user acceptance for posture checking BYOD situations?
User acceptance. BYOD. It really does come down to what you want to accept as a risk in your organisation. So when we're talking BYOD coming into your environment, you have to work out what your risk profile is. You have to work out where you see your biggest risks being, but also balancing that against what your users are likely to be bringing into your environment. So you don't want to make the bar too high, but at the same time you want to make sure that your data, your organisation is secure. So making sure that you're setting it like at a bare minimum somewhere, and I think that's the tough part, is working out what your bare minimum is going to be and then working from that. A lot of it is going to come down to your users themselves bringing in devices and coming up against those blocks that you've put in place and those compliance policies that you've put in place, and then you adjusting that. As I said, it's never going to be set and forget. You're always going to be constantly tweaking it.
Well, Jess, thank you again. Here's a present from AusCERT for some delicious locally made gin. Everyone would like to thank Jess for a great talk.
Thank you very much.